Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Matt, and today I wanted to talk about motivation in language learning. And in particular, I wanted to take a deep dive look at motivation and all of the kind of aspects of it with regards to language learning. And if you're watching this video, maybe you're lacking motivation right now. Maybe you feel like you're in a plateau, you're stuck, you don't feel like you're making that much progress, you're stuck in the intermediate stage or the beginner stage or wherever, and you're just trying to find that motivation. You're trying to find that solution. And what I want to do in this video is to help give you motivation, but also kind of give you some tools and ways to think about motivation that's overall going to help you a lot in the end of the day to make more progress in your language learning. Now, that being said, I'm going to cover a lot of different aspects about motivation. So I'll leave the timestamps for this video, and it's going to be a long video, so feel free to skip around to the parts that make sense to you. And for the most part, you can probably just listen to this. You don't really need to visually see anything. There's just going to be a bunch of slides with some summary text on there. And like I said, skip around to where it makes sense. But I do think that there is a lot of value throughout the whole video because really understanding motivation, the reasons why we might be having motivation or why we're struggling, is very important in the end of the day. And I'm going to be talking about a bunch of different things, right? I think this is going to be a little bit more detailed, a little bit more in depth compared to some of the other videos out there about how to get motivation with learning a language. I really wanted to tackle a lot of the questions that are out there and really kind of give you some really detailed and deep answers about motivation with, like I said, the goal being overall helping you to make more progress in the end of the day, to have a more enjoyable experience with learning a language and really get something materially out of this versus kind of a 5 minute hit or an 8 minute hit from a video that's just going to give you temporary motivation. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So I think the first thing to talk about is really understanding motivation. And I think that's really very critical, right? Really to ask ourselves the question, what is motivation? How do we get it? Just kind of this kind of core idea behind motivation. And in my opinion, there are a lot of core aspects on why we might be feeling motivated or not motivated in the language learning process. There's more than the ones that I've listed below, but I do think that just some of the kind of the core ideas out there cover most of the reasons why we might be lacking motivation with learning a language or why we're super motivated, etc. So, in my opinion, really a lot of the core reasons why people are not motivated is, the first thing would be, do you actually want to learn the language, right? Are you kind of motivated to learn a language for, superficial reasons, reasons that are really not sustainable for kind of long-term acquisition of the language to a very high skill level. The second would be, are you enjoying the learning process? I do think that there's a lot of people out there that are kind of using boring methods with their language learning. They're not using fun and compelling content, and maybe they're kind of getting grinded down. They're very bored with the way that they're approaching language learning. Maybe you have these kind of feelings that you're not making progress. You're stuck in a plateau, and things just aren't working out no matter what you do. This can definitely be a kind of a source of not having motivation. Maybe there's external life factors influencing your motivation. Just life is busy, or kind of other things are bothering you and are taking away from language learning. And maybe, in another sense, there's not a good reason for the activity, for to have motivation for the activity that you're doing right now. Maybe you're kind of at a very elementary level, and just focusing in on grammar or something along those lines doesn't make a lot of sense right now, and thus you don't have motivation. And obviously, there's a lot more reasons than the kind of things that I've mentioned here, but I really do think that in the end of the day, when we're talking about motivation, it really kind of comes down to asking yourself questions. Why do we not have motivation, right? It can be reasons beyond the ones that I've just listed here, but the key to understanding motivation is once again asking yourself questions and then trying to figure out why we don't have motivation. We start from that place, we can then, identify obviously what's the problem and then try to tackle it with solutions. But if we kind of don't do this analyzation, this kind of this process of analyzing what's going on, we're going to be kind of in the dark a little bit. So the first thing to understanding motivation is, of course, to ask yourself questions on why you're feeling this way. And then from there, we'll tackle it with solutions. So I think an important question to ask yourself is, do you want to learn the language that you're learning? And I think that this is a very important question, a very critical question that you really should not be afraid to ask yourself. You shouldn't be afraid to ask yourself this question at the beginning or at any time, really. And I think that really a lot of people, unfortunately, are learning languages for very superficial reasons, right? I think that in some cases, people are learning, a bunch of languages to get validation from others, or just learn, they're learning one language for validation from others. In some cases, it's to kind of maintain this identity as a polyglot, or people like the idea of learning a language, but the actual practice of it is very different. In some cases, you might want to learn the language, but it's just not a significant and major priority in your life. There's just too much going on, and maybe you'll get to it later on, and there's just too much going on. Or maybe you want to learn a language, but your why is really not that strong. It's not strong enough to kind of justify going through the process to fluency. And I think that a lot of times people don't talk about this because it's a negative topic, right? It's a scary topic. But I think it's a very important concept, and it's a great concept to apply to kind of all aspects of your life. Because in the end of the day, when you kind of take these ideas, the things that you're doing, and put them to the test, right? You take a fine look at them and judge them based off of their merits. Ultimately, the good ideas will pass the test. They will pass the trial of evaluation. And the bad ideas will, obviously kind of fail the test. And I think that people are scared of what they might find. But if you think about it, ultimately, if like I said, they're great ideas, they'll pass the test no problem. There will be strong enough reasons to learn the language, and there will be no problems in the end of the day, or with any other idea that you're maybe evaluating. And think about it this way too. Let's say that you evaluate an idea and you determine that it's just not worth it. Well, it seems negative, right? You're kind of back at square one, but ultimately, over the long term, it's trying to help you with life, right? You don't even have to apply this with language learning. Let's say that you want to learn guitar and you do this evaluation process and you realize, you know what, I actually don't want to learn guitar. This is not something that I want to do. Well, you've just, obviously, maybe you've lost a little bit of time learning the guitar because you're a beginner still. But in the long term, you've saved yourself a lot of time and a lot of energy, and now you can focus your life on things that are important to you. So it's the same idea with language learning. In the end of the day, this evaluation process is ultimately helping you in your life. I think that's very important to just think about. Don't be afraid to ask yourself this question, whether or not you're at an advanced level, intermediate, or beginner, right? Just because you're learning a language doesn't mean you need to become a polyglot or pick up another language or even get to, the max level of skill. Just always be kind of asking yourself questions and be asking, does it still make sense to learn this language? Do I really want to learn this one? Does it make sense? And it's critical to ask yourself this question. If we can kind of agree that yes, you do want to learn the language, now we can kind of drive down into the motivation or a lack of motivation with the language learning process itself, right? But obviously, if we don't want to learn the language, then the rest of the evaluation, the rest of the analysis doesn't make much sense. So ask yourself this question first. Don't be afraid of it. And even if you kind of are watching this video and you come to the conclusion that, hey, I don't want to learn a language, I think that that can be a productive and a positive thing for you. Now, that might seem kind of odd coming from someone that's making videos about language learning, right? Because oh, I don't, you're not a repeat viewer or something like that. But ultimately, I'm doing this to help you. And if it doesn't make sense to learn the language, then do something else with your time. I think that's far more valuable for you in the end of the day. And like I said, you can apply this concept beyond language learning. So the first thing, once again, is to evaluate your reasons for learning the language. Do you actually want to learn the language that you're learning? Now, I want to stress, you don't need really serious reasons to learn a language, right? Like maybe you just enjoy it. It's something that you want to do. Um, what my objective with this is just to kind of get you to think about things. Like I said, you don't need to do this just because your work demands it or whatever. I think that it's just important to ask yourselves these questions because the thing about it is if you kind of just come to the conclusion, yes, you want to learn this language for whatever reason, and it's a good enough reason to continue, guess what? Now we don't have to doubt ourselves anymore about do we want to learn the language, right? We kind of checked off a box. So once again, just kind of before continuing again, I do want to stress you don't need super serious reasons. I'm not saying oh, only people that can dedicate 6 hours a day to doing this should go and do this process. I'm not saying that, but it's just to get you to think about things in a little bit different of a way. And like I said, if we can just answer yes to this question, I think it will help you a lot because now you're not going to doubt yourself as much. You might still doubt yourself, but you won't doubt yourself as much. And I think that's important. So, another thing that I think causes a lot of people to not have motivation is that they're not enjoying the language process. And I think that a lot of language learners are not having fun and they don't have goals or a plan on how to get to a place where they're using fun and compelling content. Um, and I think this is very important. Especially if your goal is fluency or a high skill level, just because it takes so long to get to fluency, and at some point you really want to start having a lot of fun in your language learning process to start using compelling material because if you're having fun or a lot more fun and you're using interesting content, it's going to be way easier to just get motivation, to have motivation, to just get to that high skill level in the end of the day. And I think that if you're at a beginner stage and you don't have a lot of flexibility, you don't know much of the kind of much of the language at this point, and it's difficult to kind of use compelling content, whether that's video games, podcasts, reading in a foreign language, whatever it is. I think that you should try to create a goal on getting to a place where you're using fun and compelling content in the language learning process. Now, I think that a lot of people think that's way further off than it is, but it really isn't. You can start using compelling content a lot earlier than you probably think. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to be super easy. It's probably going to be a struggle. There's going to be words that you don't know. There's going to be grammar that's complicated. Some of the audio content might be a wall of sound, but you should really definitely try to get to a place where you're using compelling content in your language learning. And I think that, past the beginner stage and into the intermediate phase and beyond, this is critical. And, you want to do things like reading because not only is it a great way to pick up vocabulary and grammar, but it's fun and compelling. Start using audio content, watching Netflix shows, playing video games in a foreign language, listening to podcasts, practicing speaking. But you gotta, do the things that are gonna get you there especially if you're at the beginning stage. And pretty much the biggest thing that you can do at that beginning stage is just acquire a ton of words. Get a ton of words, get a basic foundation in grammar. And if you kind of do those two things, it's going to help you to get to that compelling content phase a lot quicker. So I think that enjoying the language process is very critical. Now, in some aspects too, you might not even just be a beginner, you're an intermediate, and you're still kind of you're still struggling, you're still not having fun, right? So everything I've said is like you might say, oh well, that's great, Matt, but I'm not in that position. I'm still not having fun. What do I do here? Well, I think that in some cases, your strategy or your method is the problem. It's going to depend on a person by person basis, but in some cases, maybe the way that you're learning vocabulary is just not very fun or it's not effective anymore. There's kind of certain methods and there's certain ideas in the language learning process that work at certain periods and then they stop working or they become less effective. Maybe flashcards work really well for you at the beginning stages, but then once you kind of get a little bit more skilled, now you should try to transition into reading. So I think that this kind of goes back to the idea I was talking about a while ago, which is asking yourself questions, right? Asking yourself questions constantly on whether or not, hey, should I do something different in terms of my strategy? Should I do a different an app in terms of learning new words or whatever it is? So I think you want to always be asking yourself kind of questions in terms of just hey, how can I have more fun in what I'm doing? Maybe the content is not fun anymore, and really you need something new. You've been listening to the same news kind of program again and again, and now you need something new. Maybe the material that you're using is way too difficult, and you need to just find something that's a little bit easier, or it was just the weird combination of words and grammar that is making reading difficult. And if you go to something else, it'll be a lot easier. I think that really just asking yourself questions and taking a look, especially if you're at that intermediate phase, about how you can be having more fun is very critical. So, definitely be using compelling activities in your language learning process, whether that's reading, speaking, video games, or audio content. I mean, I think this is so critical from a motivation perspective. And there's going to be days where we're not having fun. There's going to be days where the thing we have to do is kind of a grind. But I do think that having fun in your language learning process should be a critical objective of yours in the end of the day. So now I wanted to talk about kind of each of these kind of compelling content areas, or at least a couple of them. And they are really kind of just huge areas in of itself. So I can only really kind of cover so much, but hopefully we can kind of talk about them just a little bit to kind of help you to have more fun in your language learning process, or to start to incorporate them in general. Now, I think that reading is a great method for acquiring vocabulary and learning grammar and context. Really, reading was one of the biggest things kind of I've ever done in my language learning that was just a huge difference maker. And I think that unfortunately, a lot of people aren't really reading, but reading is phenomenal. It's a great way to just learn so much in the language learning process, but also just be learning in general. And I think that the best way to approach reading is just to think about the things that you want to learn about, right? What interests you? Maybe it's history, technology, music, whatever it is, and go seek out those subjects, but in the language that you're learning. And that way, you're kind of tackling two things at the same time, right? You're having fun in terms of learning more about a particular subject, or kind of staying up to date with news or whatever it is, and you're learning the language at the same time. And then obviously, as you get better at the language, it's going to be easier. You're going to be able to absorb content more quickly, and it's just going to be great in the end of the day. So I think that if you're not using reading already, especially if you're past the beginner stage, definitely try to start reading. It's huge, and it can be huge for your language learning. And I think it's a fun method, and it can really be pretty big in the end of the day. Now, the thing about it is, how do you approach reading? And like I said, there's just so many ways to kind of approach it. That's a huge topic in of itself. But I think that the best thing you can do is try to kind of use either apps or kind of aids in your reading process, right? Don't pick up a paperback book and try to read that way. There's just because, there's going to be words and grammar that you don't know. And looking it up on your phone in terms of Google Translate is just going to be very tedious. The best thing you can do is, like I said, use apps like Link, or have some plugins that kind of help you to translate certain web pages or whatever it is, to kind of help you and kind of be this kind of railing, this guide, this kind of guide along the way, that's kind of helping you to make the reading process easier in terms of being able to translate words, translate the phrases, to look up things, to keep track of things like that. So if you're going to start reading in a foreign language, I would highly suggest you use some number of aids in that process, whether that's, like I said, apps like Link, plugins in your browser, or whatever it is, because that's going to make the process far more enjoyable. It's going to be way more effective than, like I said, picking up a paperback book, and that's probably going to be very difficult. I think that in a lot of cases, that's what people do when they first try to start reading, is they just kind of go straight in, right? They try to start reading with no kind of help or aids whatsoever. And I think that's a big mistake. So definitely use the apps or the plugins or whatever it is to kind of help you with the reading process. If you kind of use those things, what I think you'll find is that you'll start learning a ton of vocabulary, you'll start learning a lot of grammar, and you're going to have a lot of fun. I think that's huge. So on a basic level, that's kind of how I would approach reading. Obviously, it's a huge subject in of itself, but that's kind of I think a good start for you, especially if you aren't reading already. So listening is something that is also a kind of great, kind of fun and compelling activity out there. And I think that a lot of people kind of know this intuitively, right? They want to watch Netflix shows in a foreign language, or listen to podcasts, watch TV, maybe play video games. And probably the biggest obstacle is that it's just so difficult. It just is a wall of sound, and they're just not at that skill level. Now, I think that listening is something that's very important in the overall language learning process. You need to listen a lot. It takes a lot of time to get really good at listening. But luckily, it's one of the easiest things that you can do, right? You can do this as you do other activities in your life, whether that's, commuting somewhere, when you're cooking, cleaning, multitasking in essence. And you can get language learning in that way, in particular with listening. So I think that's a great way to practice listening. But I think that the first thing to just kind of realize is that listening is going to be difficult. In my opinion, it's one of the more challenging things in all of the language learning process. And it's just important to kind of go in with that expectation that things are going to be difficult. It's going to sound like a wall of sound at first. You're going to want to translate in your head. It's going to go very quickly. There's going to be weird accents and sounds at times. You're going to doubt yourself. Just I think it's important to be mentally prepared for that and to realize that it's going to take a lot of time to practice listening. Now, obviously, if you do the other aspects of the language learning process, listening is going to be easier, right? If you learn a lot of words and you learn a lot of vocabulary and you get some foundation in grammar, listening is going to be a little bit easier. But it's just going to be something that takes time. And I would also just kind of point out that don't be afraid that you don't understand everything, right? I would just say jump in. And if things are too difficult, try to find something else that's a little bit easier, or just keep just doing it and try to get something out of the listening process, right? There's just going to be instances where you're going to watch a Netflix show and you're not going to understand everything that's going on. There's going to be words that you don't know. There's going to be grammar that you don't know. There's going to be scenes that are complicated. You're not really sure what happened, but I think it's important that if you're okay with that, you're okay with that feeling of not knowing. You're going to get a lot more out of listening, and you're going to actually start to enjoy those activities a lot better. Learning a language with video games is going to be challenging at first. Learning a language with Netflix is going to be difficult at first, or the podcast that you're using, or whatever it is. Just realize it's going to be difficult. Try to be okay with that uncertainty of not knowing everything, and I think you'll come out of it. You'll come out of this process a lot better. So I think that's really very critical in terms of how you approach listening. I think a lot of people come in with that expectation that they're going to understand everything, or it bothers them that they don't understand everything. I think that you want to be okay with that uncertainty and just kind of keep all those things in the back of your mind as you go about listening in a foreign language. So, video games are another great way to learn a language, and I love video games. I've been playing video games my entire life, and not only are they fun, but they're a great way to learn vocabulary, grammar, and practice listening, and even speaking if you are just up for it. And I think that with video games, it's very difficult at first, even if you have some foundation in the language at first. And I think it's well worth it to just kind of push through those challenging times and to keep going. And it's very similar, I think, to the listening kind of ideas that I talked about earlier. But it also kind of, when you think about video games, it's incorporating a lot of different aspects, right? There's reading, there's a reading component of things. There's a listening part of things. So there's a lot of challenges coming your way. And it's very easy to be overwhelmed, right? You start up a video game in a foreign language and you just don't understand what's going on. It's very easy to get overwhelmed and then just want to quit. But I think that the key here is to just be okay with that overwhelming feeling. Take your time and obviously keep getting better at the language through vocabulary acquisition and things like that. And if you keep at it, it's going to be a little bit easier, and it's going to be more fun incrementally over time. Now, I think that the kind of best way to approach video games is obviously to have some sort of translation kind of software next to you, right? Like, so occasionally look up words with Google Translate. Don't look up every single word or every single phrase, because at that point you're playing a Google Translate game. But I do think that it's important to kind of translate words as you go. and realize too that certain games are going to be more effective for learning languages than others. So I've talked about this in the past. For example, I think that role-playing games, RPGs, are a great way to learn a language, and they're probably a lot more effective than FPS games, for example. So I think that it's just important to you just keep going and realize it's going to be difficult at first. Kind of realize that is probably going to happen, and just keep persevering and pushing through. And I have a bunch of videos on video games where I talk a lot more in depth about how to approach things. I would encourage you to check that out. I'll leave a link in the description, just because it's a huge topic in of itself. But with video games, I think it's very similar to reading and listening, or really any other compelling activity in general. Is that it's probably going to be difficult at first. You're going to be overwhelmed. Just take a deep breath, and take it slow, and realize that with enough time and perseverance, it's going to get easier. You're going to have more fun over time. You just kind of have to stick with it. So, another compelling activity is speaking. And I think that a lot of people want to speak in a foreign language. That's their primary motivation behind learning the language. Maybe they're very social, and they just want to talk to a bunch of people. But I think something that's important to just kind of understand is that you have to work on the other parts of the language process to really enjoy speaking, right? If you want to go beyond very basic conversations or greetings, you have to get some degree of foundation in vocabulary and grammar, and that's just very important. So I know that there's a lot of people that they want to start speaking immediately, or just kind of really dive into that as quickly as possible. But I think that if you want to have more in-depth conversations, definitely focus in on vocabulary acquisition. And a little bit of grammar, just because it's going to allow you to have a lot more flexibility in the end of the day. Another thing too to realize is that it's just going to take some time to get good at. Just because you know a bunch of words and a bunch of grammar doesn't mean that you'll be able to speak perfectly, right? Obviously, you'll have a kind of advantage over someone that doesn't have that vocabulary and grammar knowledge, but it's just going to take time to get to a point where you're expressing yourself accurately, elegantly, and just in general. So I think that it's just important to not get too down on yourself, especially when speaking doesn't work out. I think that a lot of people put a lot of time into language learning, and they learn a lot of words. They're putting the time in, and then when they practice speaking, they're disappointed. But if you think about it, sometimes in a lot of cases, people are only putting maybe an hour into speaking with a conversation partner each week, and really that's not that much. So like any other skill, you have to kind of put time into it to get good at it. So just because you're putting time into things like reading or vocabulary acquisition or whatever, doesn't mean that your speaking is going to be just as good. It's going to help, obviously, but just kind of try not to be too down on yourself in that sense. But I think that there's obviously a lot of ways to practice speaking. Probably the most easy way is through conversation partners, just to kind of try to do that on a regular basis. Another way that you can practice speaking is just by talking to yourself, just thinking about a subject that you want to talk about, and then just kind of practice it as if you were kind of giving a speech. So maybe you read a book recently, and you can basically just kind of narrate a review of that book, but in the language that you're learning. This can be a great way to practice speaking, especially if you don't have other people to speak with. Just in the meantime, or it's just not an option. So I think that that's an excellent way to practice speaking. Obviously, in-person events or meetups or things like that is a great way to practice speaking too. And there are other options too, like language exchanges, especially if you're looking for more free options. You don't want to spend a bunch of money on a conversation partner or something like that. There's ways to kind of talk with other people, and just maybe help them for 30 minutes in a language, and then they help you um, in the language that you're learning for 30 minutes. So there's a lot of different ways to practice speaking. I think it really kind of comes down to initiative in the end of the day. Especially if you're looking for those free options, it's going to just take probably a little bit more time and effort to kind of go seek out those opportunities. But I think that if you take the initiative to practice speaking, whether it's through conversation partners, using kind of shadow speaking as a technique, or whatever it is, you're going to get a lot out of speaking. I think the key here is just, once again, focus on some of those fundamentals like vocabulary and a little bit of grammar, and then take the initiative to practice speaking. So another thing that I think causes a lot of people to lose motivation is this feeling that they're not making progress. And it's really normal to feel this way and to feel like you're in a plateau at times and you're just stuck where you are. And this just is going to happen, quite often in the language learning process, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced. And in a lot of ways, I like to think about learning a language like crossing a desert. You're going through this kind of this terrain that looks the same, and there's not a lot of visual references to know that you are going the right way, or if you're going in the right direction quickly enough. And this can be very frustrating at times, especially when just fluency or an intermediate level or whatever it is just seems so far off. And this is where I think goal setting and tracking is a great solution, where it adds a level of measurability and accountability, and I think helps alleviate this feeling that you're not making progress, because now you can kind of visually see your goals progress over time, especially if you utilize tracking. So if you track the number of hours that you study learning the language, for example, or how many words that you're learning, or the amount of hours or conversations that you've had, or even using something built into an app, I think that can be a great way to help alleviate this, because at least you know that, hey, I am making more progress on my statistics, on my goals, I'm achieving them, I'm putting in the time every single week, and thus this is kind of a secondary sign that yes, indeed, I am making progress. I think that this is an important area that unfortunately a lot of people don't really pursue, and it's a huge topic in of itself. I have a bunch of videos on it. I'll also link that in the description below. But I think that goal setting and tracking is huge for this kind of idea of and feeling that you're not making progress. Really, a lot of that comes down to measurability, and just kind of trying to add this kind of aspect of things where you can track and just kind of see your results over time. At times, though, there's a change of strategy is necessary. So certain methods and ideas work really well at certain parts of the language process. So a method that worked really well at the beginning stages maybe is not so great at the intermediate or advanced level. Or maybe you just need some novelty and some newness in your strategy. You want to learn words in a different way. Use some different audio content. Maybe the news kind of program that you're using is just getting boring or a little repetitive and you need some novelty. Or maybe it's trying a new compelling activity out, like reading, playing video games in a foreign language, or something like that. Other times it's really not about the strategy, but you have to keep working at it and do what you're doing already. Sometimes I think it's really easy to get impatient and just want to get to the advanced level, to get to fluency. But I think it's really important to enjoy the process. And sometimes, you're doing everything right, and there's just too much questioning and analyzing going on that's unproductive, right? Where we think we have to keep changing our method, keep changing our strategy, readjust our goals every day, every week. And that's sometimes not productive, right? Where we're changing things up too much. It's good to change our strategy up when it's necessary, but that can also be unproductive, especially if we're doing it too much. Or it really just comes down to we got to put the work in, and just some days are going to be a grind, some days we're not going to be motivated, and it's just going to be difficult. So realize that there's just a lot of different aspects with this kind of feeling of not making progress, but oftentimes I think it really comes down to trying to add a degree of measurability to things through goal setting or tracking, changing your strategy at times, or really just kind of sticking with it and keep going through the process, and just kind of believing that you're going to kind of get over that plateau. And like I said, in those times where it's just there is no strategy change and you just have to keep pushing through, your goals and your tracking and routine and things like that are going to help you to kind of keep persevering in that time. So as you can see, they're all kind of connected together in that sense. So I think that's really important to just remember in the end of the day. Other times, it's external life factors that are going to be the reason why we're really not motivated. And there's just going to be times in life where other things get in the way of language learning, and we have bad days, we have bad weeks. And sometimes language learning is just not a priority, or it shouldn't really be a priority given certain things that are going on in our life. And that's totally okay, it's important to not be too hard on yourself and to rest when you need to rest, or take care of other things when you need to do that, right? The goal is just a goal in the end of the day. It's there to serve you and help you along the path. it's not something to make your life miserable, right? So I think it's important to kind of have that balance and just, remember that there's going to be these external life factors that are going to, affect your studying and progress at times, something that can be pretty significant is just being sleep deprived, for example, or not being in the best emotional state or being really busy. So I think that, it's just important to realize that sometimes, the lack of motivation is just the other things that are going on in your life. And I think that something that's helpful to do is just to have a routine that can help to deal with the chaos of life because there's going to be days where you're just tired, you're just not motivated, you're just having a bad day. But if you're just kind of used to doing language learning every day, you have a routine, you or feel comfortable doing it, it's just going to be a lot easier to do it, and you're just kind of going through that kind of standard thing that you do every single day or every week with your routine. And I think that helps to ensure you have more language learning progress, over the long term. Obviously, there's going to be days where you break that routine, but it's just, I think it's a good way to keep your language learning up, especially with the volatility of life, right? And I guess some people might think that's a little intense, but it's, I think it's no different than working out, right? It's good to have a routine with working out, and it's also good to have a routine with language learning. Other times it's just, we're not in the best state with language learning, right? There's other things going on, and um, we're just not motivated. And I think that a couple of things that can be really helpful to deal with this lack of motivation is one, exercise. I think exercise is a great way to just kind of reset the emotional clock a little bit and just kind of, get some of those feelings of frustration out that we might be having or whatever it is, and then kind of come back to language learning after that. Or just in general, I think it's good, just in terms of maybe dealing with some of those external life factors. Another thing is just taking action. When we have problems going on with language learning, we're really frustrated with our progress, or we're frustrated with something else. Sometimes the best solution is just to take action, right? To take action to solve the problem, right? Rather than kind of just complaining and being negative about something. It's just best to take action, or just to kind of keep ourselves busy and just make some progress somewhere. So I think that can be a helpful thing as well. Sometimes too, limiting the amount of time that you're spending reflecting and analyzing is important. It's very easy to get into this place where you're analyzing too much. You're doubting whether or not you're doing the right strategy, or does this make sense? Should I do things differently? Sometimes it's best just to take that action and keep going. Stop reflecting all the time and analyzing. There's a time and place for that, but I think that just try to limit it. Limit it to once a month, once a week, or something like that. Put the work in, put the time in, and then ever so often come back and say, okay, does this still make sense? How can I make it different or better or what have you? I think other times being social is a good remedy to some of these kind of factors, right? Where just be social with your language learning, or just take a break from language learning and go be social, and that can be a nice reset to your motivation overall. Or just do something fun, right? There's a lot of ways to have fun in language learning with things like video games, Netflix shows. Be kind to yourself and go do those fun activities. And if you don't want to do language learning, just go do something fun for yourself, right? The fact that you don't do language learning for a day or a week is not the end of the world. Even if it's part of your goals or routine, you can take a break. Just sometimes go do something fun, right? There's maybe this pressure or feeling like you have to do language learning. You don't really, honestly, in the end of the day. So sometimes it's just go do something fun, go do something for yourself, and that break at times can be kind of this great reset to kind of get motivation. So just realize that there's a lot of external life factors that I think can affect your motivation with language learning. Just be aware that there's things that you can do, obviously, to kind of try to offset those, but it's just going to be a part of life. It's just that's the way things are. So just I think it's important to be aware of this, and then of course try to tackle them, in terms of how it makes sense for you. So another thing that might kind of cause a lack of motivation is your reason for doing a certain activity in the language learning process is just not there. And I think it's really important to just not have this pressing need to do something, especially when it just doesn't make sense. So, for example, let's say you're just first starting out and it just doesn't make a lot of sense to kind of go into some of the nuance with the grammar in the language, right? Is you're not going to get a lot of value out of it. You're probably going to forget most of it. Maybe if you're going to focus on grammar, hit some of those very high impact items. But other than that, it's probably not really, that useful. And I think that might be a good kind of example of, there might be some activity that you're trying to do, but there's just not the why there. There's not that that motivation and that reason to do that activity. And I think that in many cases, this best strategy is just to wait until it makes sense to go pursue that activity. In a lot of cases, I think that there's not necessarily motivation per se to practice listening or to even speak. And it might sound like a great idea. For example, if I tell you, oh, you should try to practice speaking as much as you can or listening, but maybe it just doesn't make sense. Maybe you're focused in on vocabulary acquisition, you're happy doing that, then that's fine. I think that when it makes sense for you to go pursue those things, then you'll probably have more motivation. So I think that it's important to just kind of realize that there's going to be kind of different phases in the language learning process where things will make more sense to do them versus other times. And like I said, while it might be a good idea to start trying to practice listening early, maybe it just is going to take some time for you in the end of the day. But I think that in the end, the key here is just to think for yourself and look at your own situation, right? There's going to be times where it just doesn't make sense to do a certain activity or to do things a different way, even if it's kind of maybe a little bit different than kind of the standard advice out there. I think just try to look at your situation and optimize it, given your circumstances, but just kind of realize that sometimes it's just the activity doesn't make sense. That's the kind of cause of your lack of motivation. So now I wanted to kind of talk about some general tips for language learning, some kind of ways to get motivation, and some strategies beyond just kind of thinking about principles and things like that. So the first one would be something I like to call the 2 minute rule, which basically is this kind of idea to help you to just get started with language learning. I think some of the biggest problems with just getting motivation early on is just getting started, right? Just getting started to practice vocabulary or do your study for the day. And basically, the kind of general approach with this is um, just kind of commit to saying, okay, I'm only going to do vocabulary for 2 minutes or 30 seconds, and that's it. And kind of what you'll find is that when you just kind of commit to doing only 2 minutes, you go for a little bit longer. It becomes 5 minutes and then 15 minutes. And then before you know it, you've done an hour. And so it's just kind of this commitment to get you started in the language process itself. Now, obviously, there's going to be times where you're going to do the 2 minutes, you're not motivated, you fail, and that's that. But other times, you're going to get more language learning in. It might just be 5 minutes, it might be only 15 minutes or 10 minutes, but it's more than what you were going to do, which was 0 minutes. So the 2 minute rule is a great strategy. Like I said, just kind of when you're struggling for motivation, when you're struggling to get started doing something, just say, okay, I'm going to commit to just 2 minutes of studying, 2 minutes of listening, 2 minutes of reading, 2 minutes of speaking. And what you'll find in a lot of cases is just kind of getting over that initial hurdle of just getting started that and getting that initial momentum was all you really needed. So I think it's a great way to get motivation and just kind of get that initial momentum in your study. And so next up, I wanted to talk about the just going for it approach. And I think with this one, really what I mean is just going for compelling content, just trying it out. Even though it might be difficult, even though you think that you might not be ready, just try it out. I mean, what do you have to lose? And this can be really applied to any kind of number of situations, whether it's just, hey, let's just try to use Netflix for language learning, or let's try to play a video game in a foreign language. Let's start speaking or get a conversation partner, even though we might feel like we're not ready. I think that sometimes when we just do something new, and especially we go into the activities that we want to do, even though it might be a challenge, I think that that can give you a lot of motivation, and you might be surprised at the results. So I think that sometimes a good little tip for motivation is to just go for it. Try those activities that you want to do and just, at least go in with the expectation that things might be difficult, but that might just give you a little bit of motivation to help you out in the end of the day. So next up, we have the change your environment approach. And sometimes all you really need is a change of your environment, right? And that could be just, hey, why not go learn a language outside or in a different room of your apartment or your house? I think that sometimes the novelty of just your environment can be very helpful, right? Maybe you have a very quiet environment and maybe putting some music on will be helpful, or you've been using music and it's better to just try it in a silent environment, you know? I think just going to different places, whether it's a coffee shop or a library, can be very helpful. And especially if you kind of go somewhere outside of your own home for language learning, it can kind of help you to. It can force you to just have to do language learning, right? So, for example, if you go to the park to learn a language, and it takes you 20 minutes to go there, right? Now there's kind of this larger incentive to learn the language, right? Because you've already wasted or spent the time rather going to the park, right? And you can't get that time back. So I think that changing your environment up can be a great way to get motivation for language learning, and it can really help you to have a lot more quality time with the language. So I think that that's a great tip for motivation in general. So next up, we have the multitasking approach, and this is an interesting one, but it basically means that, hey, when you're doing kind of other activities in your life, try to incorporate language learning with them. So, for example, as you are cleaning your house, maybe you can listen to language learning as you do that, or you can have a vocabulary list next to you, and you can occasionally glance at the words, right? Or some other activity that you're doing. Something that you could also do is, let's say you're playing a video game. You can play the video game for 15 minutes, and then after every maybe 15-minute increment, you review a vocabulary list once, just for 2 minutes. And so that way you can get some incremental vocabulary in, just in between. Just some breaks of whatever that you're doing. So it's a little bit kind of different than I think the other ones, and you might not be as engaged, but I think it's a great way to just get some incremental language learning in, and it might just give you enough. It might be such a low ask that it'll give you the motivation to just do that, which I think will help a little bit in the end of the day. So try out that kind of multitasking approach. Like I said, it can apply to so many different things, whether it's just you're doing some other task and occasionally you look at a vocabulary list, you use listening as you multitask, or maybe you read something, for 2 minutes, or review a grammar list every 2 minutes in between some other task that you're doing. So I think that can be very helpful to your overall language learning. So another thing that you can do for motivation is the inspiration strategy. And basically this is just try to find something that's going to inspire you to learn the language. So I think for some people, it's just listen to some music in the language that you're learning, right? Maybe that's something that's inspired you to learn the language that you're currently studying. And that can be just kind of give you this little burst to, hey, I want to study the language. Maybe it's looking at photos of the country that you want to visit that speaks that language, or you just kind of maybe watch a motivational video or something like that. I think that sometimes just watching something inspirational, whether it's from a music perspective, looking at places that you want to go visit, can be very helpful and inspiring, which can help you to have motivation. And last up, we have the accountability method. And this is something that I think can be helpful for some people, but maybe not others. But it's basically just try to reward yourself if you get your language learning in for the day. So maybe if you get your 30 minutes of language learning in, then you reward yourself with some other thing in life, right? You can also take that kind of more negative approach where, hey, if you don't meet your language learning target, you have to, you can't do this activity, right? Or you can't, buy this thing. So it's not for everybody, but I think it can be helpful in terms of just, hey, adding this reward or penalty system to things. So, it's not for everyone, but I think for some people, it can help them to kind of just get started. Or just kind of get the motivation to do things. Like I said, it's not for everyone, but it is something that you could use for motivation with language learning. And so now I wanted to talk about this idea of not relying on motivation, because really at times it makes a lot of sense to not rely on motivation, because in the end of the day, it can actually be kind of cheap when in fact discipline might be way more powerful kind of a tool. And the thing is with motivation, it wanes, right? Sometimes you're motivated and other times you're not, right? We have good days, we have bad days. And as a result, it's kind of something that's very volatile. And something that I think is just great is to have discipline in your language learning. And this is where kind of a routine and goals really shine. In particular, a routine, right? Because you're in that habit of just doing language learning on a daily basis or a weekly basis. You have this routine that you're comfortable with and you're used to just spending the time and energy in the language learning process. And even though maybe you're not motivated at a particular day, you have that consistency, you're used to the routine, and that helps you to do things, right? Think similarly with a workout routine or with fitness. You might not want to go to the gym one day, and that routine kind of gets you into the gym. Despite you not having the motivation, you might fail sometimes, but that routine is helping you. And so it's the same way with language learning, that I think that having a routine and discipline can really help you, and in particular discipline. And I know that it might be scary at first, but I really do think that discipline can really help you out in the end of the day. It's not something to be afraid of. It's something that can help you to make a lot more progress in your language learning. And of course, just build this kind of idea that will help you in other aspects of your life. And of course, with goals, that's really just kind of connected with the routine, right? You have a target that you want to reach every day or every week. And thus, your routine is kind of trying to hit those targets or achieve them. So, I think that kind of when you look at routines and goals and discipline, that's a great substitute from motivation, which tends to be a lot more volatile. And just there's going to be days where you're motivated and not motivated. So consider looking at routines and goal setting and just trying to get more discipline in your language learning. I think that can really be helpful in the end of the day. And once again, once you're in a habit of doing something, things will get easier, right? Once you kind of have invested some time just getting used to the energy investment, the time investment with language learning, I really think that it'll be easier to do the language learning every day. And so you'll be asking yourself the question on how do I get motivation a lot less, right? Because you're just used to the routine. You have better discipline, you have consistency. So, don't overlook the habits. And I think that when you have that consistent routine with language learning, it will be a lot easier, especially if you are doing effective methods where you're getting a lot of results, you're having fun in your language learning, you're using compelling content. When you kind of combine all of those components together, it can be a very powerful combination where you don't really have to rely on this kind of volatile motivation. And that's what I had to say on motivation. And obviously, there's probably a lot more ideas out there than the ones that I listed, but hopefully, I gave a pretty detailed look at motivation with language learning. I hope that it's been successful and that you can take some of these ideas to make more progress in your language learning and to have more fun. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment below if you're open to it, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.